Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome to this Peak Prosperity Podcast. I am your host, Chris Martenson. You know, the world is anything but a calm oasis of steadily rising stock prices. And despite what the central banks would love to have us all believe, everything that was a predicament in 2008 is an even larger predicament today. But the biggest problem we face, in my estimation, is this. We're running the wrong stories in our heads. Sometimes they're laughably untethered from reality, such as the story that plucky American ingenuity has it on track to be the next Saudi Arabia. Now, what makes that one so spectacularly wrong is that under no circumstances ever does even the most rabid proponent of that narrative believe that the U.S. will ever again be any sort of net exporter of oil. Saudi Arabia, of course, exports 8 million barrels a day. Apples and pineapples. I mean, there's just no comparison between the two stories there. So we need to back up and rather dispassionately take stock of where we are. Really note what reality has to tell us. And I can think of nobody better to do that with than John Michael Greer, who we welcome back to the program today. John is the proprietor of the website, of course, the Archdruid Report. It's must-reading. I read it all the time, where he writes about environmental depletion and social dissent from a really non-traditional and very noteworthy perspective. He's also a man of varied and complex interests. He's an American author, independent scholar, historian of ideas, cultural critic, neo-druid leader, hermeticist, environmentalist, blogger, novelist, occultist, esotericist, you name it. He currently resides in Cumberland, Maryland, and who better than this man to help us discuss the belief systems that are likely going to lead us to empire failure, such as a widespread and blind faith that technology will swoop in and solve our ever-growing energy and environmental imbalances. Hey, welcome, John. I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on again.
So, I have a lot of conversations with people. Among the alert people, they have this feeling that something is wrong. And they say so even though they can't quite put their finger on it. Are they right? Is something wrong?
Oh, yeah. It would be hard to point to, in the broad picture. I mean, various people have various good things going on in their lives, of course, just in individual terms. But in the broader social, political, economic, ecological sense, it's hard to find anything that's going right just now.
Yeah, here's a anecdote around that. I read probably one of the more dispiriting articles I've read in a long time, which says that there's a class of investors in China who are buying rare animal parts, banking on the idea that those animals will go extinct, and of course their investments will perform fantastically. I don't know how to do anything but be depressed by a story like that.
It's a depressing story. It's a very depressing story.
But that's where we are in this narrative, not just U.S., but in China. The idea is that if I can make money at this, it's a good thing, so I'll do that. And
no matter what other consequences there are, if I make money, exactly.
Yeah, that's everything. It's like another what I thought reasonably depressing story. In Oklahoma, they went from an average of 2 earthquakes a year to we're on track this year to have 865, mostly centered around where they're doing the fracking waste fluid injection wells. And the people whose houses are falling down are saying, we would like to be protected. You should have to buy insurance. And the fracking company's argument is this. If we had to buy insurance, we wouldn't be able to afford to do what we do. Therefore, that's a non-starter. We're not going to do it. We can't make money by preventing earthquakes.
And of course, their right to make money at the expense of people's houses falling down is somehow guaranteed. I really think, if a bunch of aliens were to swoop in from a distant planet and say, we want to buy all the Earth's air, but we'll pay you $100 quadrillion for it, there'd be people who would say, oh, sure, I can learn to breathe something else.
You might be right. They might say, well, I'm going to invest in scuba tanks. This will all work out.
It's really quite bizarre. And the thing that I would point out is that all of this resembles nothing so much as if you've ever met people who belonged to, I'll use the usual pejorative term, a cult, some kind of strange religious, system that was at about a 35-degree angle from reality. You try to talk to them about anything, and pretty soon they're starting to, you get this 1,000-mile stare, and you get this series of thought-stopping cliches. Our holy prophet has said, it's Guru's grace that this is happening. And it doesn't matter what it is. It always comes back to the thought stoppers. People are doing the same thing now around everything that has to do with progress, with economic growth, with technology. It's just right back to the thought stoppers in the 1,000-mile stare. This is one of the reasons my latest book is arguing that belief in progress is a surrogate religion. It's literally, people put the same kind of faith in progress that medieval peasants put in the wonder-working bones of St. Ethelfrith or what have you. They believe in it absolutely implicitly. They cannot think outside that box. And it's leading them straight to destruction. In this case, at least, the revering the bones of St. Ethelfrith was not going to do you any particular harm. It might not ward off the Black Death, but hey, these things happen. But in this case, as you point out, we've got a set of narratives that are completely detached from the real world, and yet everyone has convinced themselves this is the real world. And if mere reality knocks on the door saying, I'm sorry, reality can go away. We know what's real. Progress is real. The great God progress will save us all.
And it seems so obvious to me that any technology has a pro, has a con. You get something, you lose something. And, whether you lose that languorous sense of space and time because we can cram every minute of our day with these beautiful little, smartphone planner devices, or whether it's the loss of social interaction that you get when you have to deal with a human face to face, or the wonderful miracle of food technology that quite obviously is poisoning the bejesus out of our population.
Yeah, there we go. Or having a stable climate, having a breathable atmosphere, little things, houses that don't fall down, little things like that.
Yeah. So here's now, whether it was the wandering bones of the saint or it's our myth of progress, is it just that are humans just predisposed towards believing in things that are fundamentally, obviously, demonstrably not true? Is that a fate that we're going to have to contend with forever?
Well, certainly human beings, under certain circumstances, will convince themselves of things that aren't true. We know that. The bones of the saint, by the way, given the power of the placebo effect, and who knows, maybe the saint was actually blessing a few people now and again. That was actually functional in some ways, although, again, it would not keep off the Black Death. But the problem comes when people have invested in a set of beliefs that worked for a while, and then they stop working. That's the situation we're in now. From basically the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to the 1970s, maybe a little later, the narrative of progress worked. Because during all that time, there was a steady increase in the availability of energy per capita, and by White's Law, which is one of the basic principles of human ecology, economic development is a function of energy per capita. So as the energy curve rose, as we broke into one after another the planet's cookie jars and stole the fossil carbon there, progress actually did happen. But the problem is that we started running into, the limits to resource extraction. And the costs of resource extraction started rising. The costs of dealing with the downsides of burning all that carbon started to rise and everything else. And all of a sudden it doesn't work. But everybody's emotionally committed to the myth of progress. They're so great a charge. It has such a religious quality to us. Progress is that which will save us. Progress, promises us this glorious Star Trek destiny metastasizing across the galaxy or what have you. To let that go, again, it's like trying to get a medieval peasant to look up and notice that heaven with God and the saints and angels isn't up there anymore. And so people are wigging out. And one of the most common ways to wig out in a situation like that is to cling to the dysfunctional belief system, the beliefs that don't work anymore, ever more tightly, even as they drag you down. And that's what we've got going on in the modern industrial world. People going through the motions of a belief system that has stopped working, but they can't let themselves admit that it stopped working, because if that's the case, then God is dead. There's Nietzsche standing there saying.
You know how I know I'm dealing with a belief system is that when I question it, I get an emotional response.
Bingo, yeah.
And I get this all the time. Adam and I, we call it the iPhone moment. So we'll do our whole song and dance. We'll put up all this data. We'll say, hey, look, oil discoveries peaked 50 years ago. And that's just reality. So guess what's going to happen sometime after a peak in discoveries? There'll be a peak in output. And people will inevitably, one, but several more times will literally hold up their phone and go, I think you're forgetting about these, right? Which is their little progress talisman. Like, how can you deny that we are making, leaps and bounds, right? And the minute I say, that's fascinating, technology can help us use energy more effectively, efficiently, but what it can't do is it can't create energy. So I'm talking about an energy source. You're talking about how we use it. Those are fundamental. And I've lost them, like, by the first time I started talking.
Of course.
I lost them minutes ago in that little diatribe.
Yeah, no, and that's just the thing. What about these iPhones? Okay, what about them? Okay, we've got this complicated little toy. It's a more complex toy than the last generation. So what? This is what I mean when I call these things thought stoppers. They're ways to stop thinking. And I think people desperately want to stop thinking, because if they think, they're going to notice what's going on. They're going to notice the gap between the reality that they're experiencing and the reality that they've convinced themselves that they should experience. Everyone insists progress, onward and upward, blah, blah, blah. Okay, for most people in the United States, standards of living has been contracting steadily since 1972. Most Americans.
Which, by the way, coincidentally, is when energy per capita peaked in this country.
Coincidentally. Yeah, sure.
Just want to point that out. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Coincidences,
Absolutely.
I gather them.
Again, White's Law. Economic development is a function of energy per capita. As your energy production declines, so does your prosperity. When I was young, your dinosaur did not quite walk the earth in those days, although it feels that way sometimes. When I was young, a working class family with one income could buy a house, could own a car, could go on vacation every so often, could keep paid up on all their bills, led a pretty good lifestyle. These days, a working class family with one income in many places can't stay off the street.
Right.
That's a huge transformation, and everyone is pretending that it doesn't matter, or almost everyone is pretending that it doesn't matter, that we're still on track. The United States can no longer afford to maintain its road system. State and county road maintenance budgets have been cut so far that in a lot of western states now, entire sections of the road system are being allowed to return to gravel because nobody can afford to keep them up. Our national bridges are a disgrace. They're falling down. What happened? Okay, we could afford to maintain our bridges up until a certain point. What happened? Nobody wants to talk about that. America is in decline. It has been declining rapidly, ever more rapidly, for decades now. Nobody wants to admit it. And so we dress up our emperor in ever more elaborate imaginary clothing. And most people, again, use the thought stoppers so they don't notice what's actually going on.
Well, it's emotionally painful to have to notice these things, because when you deconstructing a belief system is an emotionally painful process for people, and we're trained that those are to be avoided. Now, I'm of a maturity level now that I understand that there's no such thing as avoiding emotional pain. You can stuff it, and then it comes out in the most awkward ways. Later on when you least expect it or want it, it comes out sideways. Shadows are like that. But more importantly, to really face and master our emotional responses is actually an incredibly exciting and worthy challenge. And as I go back and look through all different cultures and generations and times past, people got that. But we really, in this country, in the United States in particular, we say, are you having an emotional response? If it's too much, we're going to have to drug you for that. And it's either way. Are you too manic? Are you too depressive? I mean, you too high, you too low. We got drugs for both.
No matter what. Well, I mean, everything is benefits the pharmaceutical industry at this point. The Onion, which at this point has to run full speed to stay ahead of reality and remain satirical. The Onion had a piece a little while back announcing that a study had proved that drugs and therapy were equally effective at monetizing depression.
Every so often I'll read a headline and I have to check to make sure it's not the Onion, because
I know.
They're having a hard time keeping up.
Yeah, they've got it. It impresses me that they're still able to keep on writing satire.
Well, so let's burst this tech bubble in a very concrete way. Let's talk about the shale revolution, because you know this.
You mean the fracking bubble? Yes, go ahead.
The fracking bubble. I mean, this drives me nuts because I read about it in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and Bloomberg. Except Bloomberg has one or two side, I believe they're contract journalists who are actually nipping at the edges of this thing. But generally, their center mass follows the main narrative, which is,
of course it does,
which is shale oil flooded the world and this is a permanent revolution.
That's going to become louder and louder for exactly the same reason, and you'll remember this very well, that in the final days of the housing bubble, the rhetoric around the endlessly rising real estate prices just got louder. You remember that?
I do.
Remember in 2007, 2008, just how frantic it got just before the bottom dropped out. We're in that Wile E. Coyote moment right now with the fracking bubble.
Yeah, and let's be clear, and the reason it gets frantic is because there are people who have product they want to move, and they've got to move. They got to dump it into some unwary portfolios.
Got it in one. At this point, right now, the banks are stuck with tens of millions of dollars of fracking loans that they've packaged that they're having trouble selling. That was in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. People are backing away from these smoking craters soon to appear here. They're backing away from the fracking things. Dozens of fracking firms are have either declared bankruptcy or are in the consulting with the reorganization specialists and things like that. It is shaping up to be a world-class speculative crash. But everyone in the mainstream media is doing their best not to say that because, who wants to start the run?
I know, and here's how simple it is to get your arms around this. So I was looking at Whiting Petroleum, one of the largest operators producing 180,000 barrels a day out of the Bakken play. They made a really unfortunately timed purchase a year and a half ago with Kodiak, and so they have a lot of debt. They have $5.3 billion on the books, right? So this is this took me 5 minutes in a spreadsheet. I said, okay, 186,000 barrels a day. Okay. It declines at 85% over 3 years, but there's some vintage aging, so I'll dial that back a little bit. Let's say that that's going to decline 70% over the next 3 years. Here's the average price of oil. Hey, they can't even pay back the $5.3 billion if they stop drilling. Yeah,
exactly. Even if they stop all operations and just sell, there's no way they can ever pay it back. I forget company after company. I'm trying to remember one that I saw. They reported they've had negative cash flow every single year since they entered the whole fracking thing. They've been spending billions of dollars and getting millions back.
It's just
and making up the difference with loans. Again, it's the housing bubble. It's the tech stock bubble. I mean, there's a Tets.com all over again.
Yeah, and here's how you know that you're late in the game. When they start changing the measurement stick, right? So about a year and a half ago, the EIA started saying, oh, look at per rig productivity. I'm like, whoa. Who cares about how productive a rig is? It's the wells. And people confuse it. I have people saying, oh, my God, we're getting 300% more out of the wells than we used to. I'm like, no, we're not. No. We're getting exactly the same amount out of each well that we used to get. No change in that. And that's with longer multilateral drillings, more frac stages, more use of proppant. We're dumping more and more down the holes, and we're getting just about the same amount out. And that's geology fighting technology. And they fought themselves to a standstill for the moment. That's the reality, right?
That's the reality.
But again, the eyes glaze over.
Exactly. Well, again, you'll remember in the days of the housing bubble. I lived in Ashland, Oregon, when the housing bubble was at full roar, and it's kind of a yuppie enclave. There's a lot of people with a fair amount of more dollars than cents, as my grandparents used to say, and a lot of people who were deeply into the sort of bottom-feeding New Age stuff, like The Secret, how convince yourself that you're destined to be rich and money will seek you out, kind of thinking. And the number of people I knew who were just literally, clinically irrational about real estate prices, that they had to go up. And you try telling them, look at these now. No, the eyes glaze over instantly. You get the 1,000-mile stare, and the mantras come out. And in a lot of cases, I mean, to some extent, it's simply the usual reaction of suckers who have been hooked by their own greed. A book that I recommend to everybody who's trying to follow, who's trying to stay sane in these times, John Kenneth Galbraith's The Great Crash in 1929. It is, to start with, the most rip-roaringly hilarious book of serious economic history you'll ever read. But the thing that Galbraith does is he walks you through all the rhetoric of the bubble.
Yeah.
The new economic era that's dawned. How many new economic eras have we had so far? It's always the same thing. But he literally walks through all of the rhetoric, all the ways that people suckered themselves into believing that stocks in 1929 could rise forever. And once you've followed that, you'll see the same rhetoric appearing again and again and again, and it has been all over the fracking bubble. All over the fracking bubble. It's a new era for the American energy industry. The old rules don't apply. Blah-de-blah-de-blah. Complete to the proclamations that U.S. Oil production is reaching a permanently high plateau.
That famous geologist Irving Fisher.
Yeah, exactly. But it's always the same thing. It's the only variation is what is the subject for the bubble. And in this case, it happens to be fracking. I mean, the fracking thing is not about energy. It's not about petroleum. It's about selling worthless paper to chumps. And an awful lot of paper has been sold to an awful lot of chumps.
Absolutely true. Now, here's the thing that's. I just read this piece this morning by this Stanford professor who said, "Oh, it looks like oil prices are going to stay down for 20 years." And he cited the fracking revolution. And I'm like, he's a Stanford professor. He should know that even the EIA says the shale revolution's over in 2020 when we run out of drill spots and it goes into terminal perpetual decline. So that's only 5 years from now. I'm wondering what where his calculations for the next 15 years came from.
A Stanford professor of what? Do you remember?
I believe it's some form of economics, but I
don't know. That explains it. That explains it. Do you know what you call an economist who makes a prediction?
Wrong.
Yeah. Just by definition. If an economist says the sky is blue, I'm going to go look.
Well, so here's the thing, though. You can look at this. The data's there, right? And you take the world oil output ex the U.S., ex Canada, and it's been going down slightly since 2005, and this is with $3.5 trillion poured into making sure it went up. And geology's winning again. So I look at that, and then I wander over and I look at the people who bought Spanish 50-year bonds for 3.8%. And I just go, what is the story you have to tell yourself to say, you know what? I like these at 3.8%. I'm going to buy me a fistful of these Spanish bonds here. 50 years. That's the year 2065 they mature. Come on, people. Think this through. Oh, my goodness.
No. We can't think this through, because if we think this through, we realize just how deep in, up to our eyeballs and alligators we are at this point. And so that's one of the temptations that makes just going through the motions and pretending that nothing has changed so tempting, because you don't have to deal with the stress. Now, as you say, sooner or later, you can repress something that'll come back. It'll come back out. It's just that people are very good at saying, no, I just don't want to deal with it now. Unfortunately, they're going to deal with it in a much harder form down the road. Now, the thing that I find really interesting is that you mentioned that production, X the tar sands and shale oil bubbles. Production has been trending down since 2005. As I recall from shortly after that, I think it was 2006, consumption has been trending not drastically down, but certainly in some areas quite steadily down. I think it was U.S. gasoline consumption, for example, has been ratcheting unevenly downwards since then. And a range of other energy measurements have. This is crucial because one of the things that's central to the, quote, discredited, unquote, peak oil theory is that if you have to put more and more and more resources, more and more real wealth into energy production, into energy extraction, let's use the correct term here, okay, you don't have those resources available for other economic activities. The dread phrase zero-sum game comes to mind here. And so as we throw more and more of our total available real wealth into the process of extracting, tar from tar sands, oil from shales, oil from super deep wells in the Gulf of Mexico, or what have you, the fact that this stuff is really expensive to produce is a good proxy for the fact that it takes immense resource inputs. And those inputs are not available for other economic uses. It's very much as though, to put it in microeconomic terms, as though, you've got your product that you're selling, but your cost of getting the product is ratcheting upward. So your profit margins are being squeezed. So your lifestyle is being squeezed. To my mind, that's the big story right now. The fact that, as I noted earlier, the U.S. can't afford its road system anymore.
So there you have it. It's like we're putting all this extra energy, effort, capital, however you want to measure it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're pouring it into these innumerable shafts into the ground in North Dakota, and Oklahoma, and other places. And and next thing we know, we turn around like, why did that bridge fall down?
Why did that bridge fall down?
That seems so unrelated.
Mm-hmm. As long as you don't think in whole systems, you can go on with the pretense. And so thinking in whole systems is practically taboo these days.
It is, because it's challenging. It's really challenging. And here's the thing, John. I know more and more people who have both that 1,000-yard stare, but they've got a little of the deer in the headlights thing too. They're scared, and there's just this general discomfort right now that's palpable. And I know it because I recently gave talks in Peru and in Mexico City. In Latin America, very different sort of discussions because they know things go pear-shaped, right? That's why you go to Peru, there's like the Nuevo Sol to replace the old Sol, which replaced the one before that. They've been through a bunch of currency complete flame-out disasters. So there's no convincing that, sometimes leaders overdo it and your currency goes, wonky on you and you have to start over. They get that, right?
They get that. Exactly. They don't stick to the pretense.
No.
Yeah.
No, so it's a very different discussion to have. I found it very liberating and freeing. It's when I come back to the United States in particular, it's like we've got some thought bubble that's been clamped down over things where it's very clear that there are subjects that are off limits because they make people uncomfortable. It happens all the time.
It is. The one thing that I'll say, though, you mentioned the sense of freedom, of liberation. I've talked to so many people here in America who have gotten to the point where they actually are saying, hold it, no, something's really wrong, this isn't working. And they talk about it and they find a community of people to talk about it, and all of a sudden this immense weight has gone off them.
Yeah.
The country is still careening down the slopes into history's compost bin. All of the aspects of our predicament are still there, but they don't have the burden of pretense anymore. And it's an immense liberation.
Yeah. Well, we hold a few seminars. We have one coming up at Roe in a couple of 3 weeks now. And honestly, Adam and my wife Becca and I, we present, but honestly, we could go to sleep for the whole weekend and people would just be have a grand old time being in a intimate setting where, natural, beautiful, intimate setting where they get to just talk about these things. Yeah. Yeah. And
where nobody's going to shut you down for saying, it's going pear-shaped, guys.
Exactly. That's so relieving. But I agree with you that more and more and more people are getting this. I just did a presentation for a class at Berkeley via Skype. I did one down in Charleston, South Carolina. And the 20-year-olds, they're like, dude, don't even bother telling me about how messed up it is. We know this stuff. Like, they know this. So I'm going to narrow this down. I think that the class of people who are most heavily blinkered are basically the boomers. That they're the ones who have the most to lose if this does go pear-shaped. They're the ones who seem rigid and incapable of understanding the dimensions of this. Because I think younger people, in my estimate, they just grew up with it. They're like, oh yeah, that's the world we live in.
The teens and 20-somethings that I've talked to, they're totally on top of it, or they're totally oblivious.
Correct. That's
one or the other. They're either glued to their eye brain, their surrogate minds, and just slurping at the media tit, or they have no clue, or they know completely what's going on. They have no illusions about the situation.
Right.
The boomers, I think it's partly that they have the most to lose, but there is, of course, the other factor, which I've written about, which is that the boomer generation was the generation that was really coming into public life at the time that America turns back on the prospect of transitioning to a sustainable future. And an awful lot of boomers sold out. Mm-hmm. I mean, the hippie generation, the people who were saying, oh, we'll never put on business suits. We're going to, peace and love and community, solar panels and windmills and geodesic domes in the countryside, and all of a sudden they're going to work for Fortune 500 corporations with a nice short haircut and a tie. There have been the boomers, generally speaking. I mean, they were one of the most idealistic generations in American history, but they were also one of the most privileged, one of the most convinced of their own entitlement, and they faced over and over again the confrontation between their ideals and their privilege, and over and over again, with certain exceptions, with certain noble exceptions, over and over again, most of them chose the privilege and spent the next 10 years insisting at the top of their lungs that they hadn't cashed in their ideals. And so you have situations now where people who were vocal environmentalists in the 1970s are now out there pimping for the nuclear industry because they can't because we've got to have a future with enough power, enough electricity to power our iPhones. And if that means loading the planet with wastes that remained lethally dangerous for 250,000 years, hey, that's fine. We've got our iPhones. That kind of betrayal of ideals, that kind of copping out, of selling out, leaves immense psychological scars. And I really think that modern American history can't be understood unless you remember just how many people who are now, the boomer generation, they're in positions of power. They are, they're largely running the country at this point. These are the people who sold out at the end of the 60s, and again with the coming of the Reagan era.
Well, it's just I'm not sure that the millennials would have done any better if we put them back 30, 40 years.
Quite possibly not. Quite possibly not. But they didn't go through that transformation. I'm not saying I'm not saying the boomers are uniquely evil. I'm saying they were the ones who were put in this situation, who put themselves into that situation, and they're dealing with the psychological scar tissue. Yeah, by the time the millennials or whoever came along, or the so-called greatest generation. I mean, there have been many great generations, but it happened to land on the boomers to make that choice one way or the other, and we know what choice they made. And I think that the psychological scarring that resulted from that is an immense, although almost unmentionable, factor at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we might call it guilt, but for me, that selling out is easy in the short term, but the loss of integrity over the long term is that's a real blow.
It's huge, and especially since in the situation as we've seen over the last 40, 50 years, they've had to double down over and over again because it was never enough. They could give up the long hair and the headbands. Okay, that's one thing. Okay, now Reagan's running for office. Are you going to give up on sustainable energy? Are you going to give up green lifestyles? Well, yeah, because we want our middle-class jobs. And then it's another thing, and then it's another thing, and then it's another thing. At any point, to say, no, I'm not going to do that, casts all your previous choices into question. But if you just keep on doubling down on it until now you're out there with like Stuart Brand, arguing, trying to sell GMOs and nuclear power, it's not just the one betrayal. It's the whole sequence heading down that road paved with good intentions that leads you nowhere. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that is an immense factor in our collective psychology right now.
So this is perfect place because this is where I see us locked into a narrative that is failing us, and all you have to do is open the newspaper or be marginally curious, and you can see all the ways it's failing us, whether it's soil loss or droughts where there didn't used to be, or lack of snow to run your dog sled races on, or record-breaking snows in other places, or it's just getting weird and wonky, right, environmentally, and the world has tacked on an additional $56 trillion of debt since the crisis began, and presumably that would be lovely if that could be paid back. And all of that's predicated on this idea of endless growth. And then, of course, there's maybe not the energy to grow endlessly, maybe even not that much longer, So we put all that into a spot, and we've got this collective denial, which I understand at heart. I get that, and can even have compassion for it if I really remove myself and look at it. Where does that take us in your mind? You've done a great job of prognosticating about sort of, how this plays out. Well, what's the kind of future you think we can actually expect on all this? Well,
of course, prognosticate. Well, it was Yogi Berra, I think, who commented that prediction is really difficult, especially about the future. My model all along, and I have not seen any reason to change it, is that of the sort of fractal collapse, where instead of either one big whomp, and we all wake up in the ashes, those of us who wake up at all, or the smooth slope of decline, is a matter of just the total number of crises, of catastrophes, of natural and unnatural disasters, of economic downturns, of economic contraction, of political failure, of war. All these just keep on ramping steadily upwards. And when exactly your number comes up to take part in the general process of decline in any given way is going to vary by factors that are very difficult to predict and that are happening right now to many people. I mean, right now, if you live in Greece, you've collapsed. Your standard of living has dropped through the floor. Right now, if you live in California, you're facing the transformation of what was one of America's wealthiest states into the combination Dust Bowl and Rust Belt of the 21st century. People who lose their job and don't ever get a new one, which is increasingly common in America these days. The total number of people we don't report as unemployed because they're permanently unemployed just keeps on ratcheting upwards. And so you've got this bizarre situation where people can pretend that that everything's fine, business as usual, we're on our way to the stars, until something happens to them, and then they're kind of edited out of the picture. That said, I expect some fairly large jolts in the near future. When the fracking bubble implodes, I think we've got a pretty fair likelihood of at least a massive crisis here in America, probably a massive financial crisis worldwide. I have seen figures. I don't know how well documented, what the kind of documentation is beneath them, that the total amount of dubious credit that's been manufactured in the course of funding the fracking bubble is about twice what was produced to fund the housing bubble. So that's going to leave some gaping holes in a lot of balance sheets as that goes pear-shaped. So we're looking at a major economic crisis in the United States and possibly more broadly in the very near future. We're looking at the likelihood of major wars. If the situation in Yemen right now spins much further out of control, we've probably got World War III in the Middle East between the Sunni and the Shia, and it could become a complete bloodbath. Now, that's the one thing I could think of that could make fracking profitable again. Because if the Persian Gulf is aflame with war and people are blowing up each other's oil installations, there's going to be a shortage of oil. Prices will go back up, and we may actually have a chance to continue fracking out until 2020. So that's something for your listeners to keep an eye on. But if that doesn't happen, it's complicated. But we're looking at a situation where the international order that's been in place since the Second World War is cracking, is going to break completely as the United States falls out of its position as superpower, and exactly who will replace it is an interesting question. The Chinese are certainly trying to position themselves. It'll be interesting to see how they deal with their own looming economic crisis, their huge overhang of unpayable debt, and so on. Mm-hmm. But that's what I'm seeing for the future. What I've been seeing all this time is one crisis after another, one catastrophe after another, one war after another, one recession, depression. Okay, let's use the D word. One depression after another, ratcheting downwards as the energy supply decreases. Again, White's law. Economic development is a function of energy per capita. As energy per capita declines, economic development goes into reverse. That's one of the things you cannot say in public.
No, because I have this thing called an iPhone. I think you should know about. Yeah,
and that iPhone is going to produce limitless amounts of energy.
Yes, and here's I agree with your backdrop that this is what I see are just steadily increasing pressures, right? Which are going to call on either our best efforts or, we'll bring our worst efforts and reap what we sow in that regard, because this is a little bit like reading Guns of August, about the build-up to World War I. There were just this lot of pressures and, some failed empires and some, inbred leadership and literally in some cases and all of these sorts of things that just basically became a tinder pile. So I'm looking at the world as having a lot of pressures on it at this point in time, and I'm mystified to this day by what the United States is up to in Ukraine, because we're really
that's just mad.
We're poking the bear, and so here's this was one of my is this an onion moment, and it turned out it's not. So ABC News reported that the United States is sending in a bunch of paratroopers to train with quote unquote the National Guard in Ukraine. And we're sending them in to train with the Azov Battalion, which is one of the privately funded battalions that is famous for having the Waffen-SS insignia and doing all that. And we're sending them in on April 20th, which a little Googling revealed to me is Hitler's birthday. Now, is anybody thinking this through in the Pentagon? And if they are, was that on purpose? I mean, is I can't make sense of how you could either be that tone deaf or that obvious. I don't know which of those two things to be more outraged about.
Unless they're hoping to elicit a violent response from Russia.
Ah, right.
That's the one. But the thing is, United States foreign policy has been stark staring nuts. Drooling idiocy barely covers it. Strategy 101. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. had one absolute top strategic requirement, which was to make sure that Russia and China remained on opposite sides of some kind of line of hostility, to drive them apart. The most sensible thing would have been to basically do something like a Marshall Plan for Russia, establish a U.S.-Russian alliance, and use that to counter the rising power of China. That would have been a brilliant move. It would have been a very smart. It might have sustained the U.S. empire for another century. We could alternatively have gone into an alliance with China, followed up on Nixon's original. I mean, that's very clearly what Nixon was trying to do, to try to drive the largest possible wedge between the two big communist powers at that time. He succeeded brilliantly. Instead, what do? We have gone out of our way to take the two other large nuclear powers in the world and drive them into alliance, to create a Eurasian power bloc that has more resources, more people, more weapons, and at this point better technology than we do. We've created our own nemesis, and we're adding to it day by day. I mean, I have no idea what's going through the heads of the people who think they're running U.S. foreign policy, but for 20 years we've been pursuing just an utterly self-defeating, utterly self-destructive agenda, which is going to lead to I'm convinced is going to lead to disaster for the United States.
I think it will, and one of the things I've been talking about is that a lot of it's perception. Perception rules a lot in life, and United States people say, well, the United States is the world's reserve currency, and of course, it's backed by having the most powerful military in the world, and that's the perception, right? Like, well, that's true if and only if you can project that power. And how do we do that? Well, we do that with this thing called the Blue Water Navy, right? So we have all these ships out there. And one of the things I keep telling people is, like, you got to go onto LiveLeak. You got to look at these anti-ship missiles, the Yakon 800 and other similar things, the Sunburns that the Russians have, because they completely teach you that a Navy is no longer a useful thing, right? But we still have the perception that it is. And I don't know if you caught this, but I love this incident. The USS Donald Cook sailed into the Black Sea last April to show the Russians a lesson. Now, this is an Aegis class destroyer. It's packed with the most brilliant electronics in the whole world, and this thing has, it's got 50 anti-aircraft missiles, and it's just like it's its own little island of death. The Russians sent one Su-24 Sukhoi jet, flew it over this thing, and jammed every electronic thing on board, just shut it down with some technology that they have, and then proceeded to fly back and forth in mock bombing runs, and would have just taken the ship out. This is our most advanced ship in the world. It was taken out by a single jet, just shut down. And to me, that was a huge warning sign. And I would have thought that our response to that would have been something like, you know what, maybe we don't really want to poke that bear, because if we lose the perception of having this indomitable military, we lose a lot, possibly including reserve currency status.
Among other things. My most recent novel, I've got 3 novels out, but my most recent one is a near future novel called Twilights Last Gleaming, and it actually focuses on the consequences of the United States getting itself into a situation where it actually suffers a serious military defeat, and yes, the effective destruction of a carrier task force is a central part of that. Did you catch the story? I think it was last year. The Chinese had a submarine come up in the middle of a U.S. military naval exercise.
Yeah, they came up and they waved.
They came up, they waved, they went down. Nobody had detected them. They could have carried out torpedo runs against the carrier and everything else in sight. And the Chinese are turning out they're turning out these first-rate, very silent subs. And they're turning out these light catamaran missile boats, which I think are probably going to be the prototype of the post, the navies in the age of the cruise missile. They're small, they're light, they're disposable, they're very fast, and their basic purpose is to get within range to launch cruise missiles or something. But we're still fixated on our aircraft carriers. The thing is, this happens. In the run-up to, you mentioned 1914. In the run-up toward 1914, everybody was convinced, in Britain, that Britain's survival depends on battleships. So they put an immense amount of money into building building and upgrading their battleship fleet. And the battleships did absolutely nothing during the war. I mean, they had one big there was a Battle of Jutland, which was completely inconclusive, after which everybody's fleets just went home and sat out the war. And then in the run-up to World War II, the British did exactly the same thing, put all their money into battleships, when the smart money was going into aircraft carriers. And among other things, that's why Britain had most of its holdings in Southeast Asia and Indonesia scooped by the Japanese, because the British had battleships and cruisers down there, and the Japanese simply bombed them into oblivion from the air. We're facing exactly the same situation with our aircraft carriers. At some point soon, I don't know what soon amounts to here, but at some point the U.S. is going to send a carrier group into some situation, and there's going to be a flurry of missiles from the shore, and the age of the aircraft carrier is going to end. And the United States, the reputation for invincibility the United States has, is going to end too. And the consequences of that are immense. Those are things that I was trying to sketch out in this novel of mine, Twilights Last Gleaming.
Well, I can't wait to read that. I love thinking things through from that, because I think we have to think through the scenarios. But it's been completely obvious to me ever since an aging A4 aircraft using a French Exocet missile sank the HMS Sheffield in the Falklands War. What was that, 1983 or something? I mean, that was like, that taught me in couple decades ago, like, oh yeah, the ships are done. Right. But still there's this perception that, that the United States has this very powerful military, and it's true, but it's true only because we haven't gone up against somebody who knows how to sink ships yet. We've beat up on Noriega, and we did a little Grenada action, and we did a little, Saddam action, but it's like an NFL team that's gone up against 3 Pee Wee leagues and has decided it can't be beat.
Yeah. And that's exactly it. I mean, we sent our bombers against the Serbs, and the Serbs shot down one of our stealth planes. Remember that one?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, they did.
Yeah, which the remains of the plane were then quickly shipped off to Russia. And all of a sudden, they've got first-rate stealth fighters, and we're stuck with the F-35. We could have a long conversation about that dog.
Oh, my God. So that's just $1 trillion program that is not, oh, boy, it does nothing. So this is...
No. It has performed brilliantly at its mission, which is to completely destroy the U.S. Treasury. It has been enormously successful as a money sink.
It's bombed the Treasury successfully. Hit rate,
exactly,
100%.
Exactly, hit rate 100%. It just doesn't do anything else well. But then nobody actually thinks that there's ever going to be a hot war where the United States actually has to scramble serious planes. And if that ever happens, we're up to our eyeballs in alligators, as I said.
So this is what's mysterious to me, because I see this mostly being driven by the State Department and a bunch of neocons, right? You look at Victoria Nuland and understand that her husband is one of the signatories on the Project for a New American Century, which is that document that just magically managed to predict another Pearl Harbor striking the United States in a couple of years that would galvanize our Mideast response. And so she's really in bed, literally and figuratively, with the neocons, and these people frighten me because I don't think they are grounded in reality at all. I'm wondering, where's the military on this? Because they have to be aware of these issues. They're pretty level-headed on these things.
It depends. It depends on who you talk to, because the U.S. military is huge. There's vast numbers of people, and many of the people in the upper echelons, especially in things like purchasing, they're looking at their 7-figure civilian contracts that they're going to get as soon as they finish their 20 years. And the thing is, there's a lot of corruption in the U.S. military. There's a lot of corruption. I don't know if you follow the War Nerd.
No.
No, he's a columnist. I forget the guy's actual name, but he writes under the War Nerd, and highly worth reading. He's extremely well informed. He did a piece on the F-35, where he argues that this shows that the U.S. Air Force has now won the prize as the most corrupt branch of the U.S. military, because all these, everybody's kind of playing along and insisting that the F-35 really is this marvelous new plane, even though it can't fly safely, and it's the software that will enable it to actually hit a target hasn't been finished yet, and blah, 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 blah.
Doesn't even put oxygen in the masks of the pilots sometimes. So,
for example,
got a few things going on.
But yeah, I think one of the problems here is that there is with that kind of money and that kind of culture of that doesn't really matter. The people I know in the military who are out there on the cutting edge, the people who are actually going to be flying the planes, who are actually in harm's way, they're great people. I know a fair number of them. I respect them deeply. There was a term in the NAM years, REMF, R-E-M-F, rear echelon. I'll let you figure out for yourself what NF stood for in soldier slang. And that was because you get people who will never see combat, who are sitting behind large LSD, large field desk commanders. A lot of money flows through their hands. There's a lot of opportunities for graft, and some people have taken them. And so you've got a situation where we have, on paper, the most powerful military in the world. We certainly have the most expensive military in the world. We have a military that is unfortunately riddled with graft, that is riddled with technology that doesn't work, and strategies that are being, the vast strategic doctrines that have been generated to justify preferred technologies rather than because they'll actually be of any use. The centrality of the aircraft carrier to to current American, the air-sea battle. I think they've changed the name again. But current American strategic doctrine still relies on aircraft carriers, not because carriers are useful, because we have this huge investment in them, because it's very prestigious to be a carrier commander. And so all the people who have a personal, financial, or emotional investment in the carrier arm are coming up with all these scenarios where carriers are the salvation. Just as their equivalents in Britain in the 1920s came up with all these scenarios where battleships were going to save Britain.
It's fascinating, this level of delusion that exists out there. It's happened at every major turning point, and for different sets of reasons. This one's really interesting to me. There's times I bemoan our current state, and there's other times I go, this is honestly one of the most fascinating times to be alive ever.
Yeah.
It is for all sorts of reasons, but not least of which is this is when I think, a guy that I trained under to learn how to do trading, and he helped me spot what a bubble really is. And he says bubbles always have a final blow-off parabolic spike. That's the last act, right? And so you get to recognize when you're getting towards the end of something. But I think we're having that last gas parabolic blow-off spike in denial, right? Like it's just reaching a fever pitch.
I hope.
And because the gap between the stories we're telling ourselves and what reality is trying to inform us on is really profound. I don't know how people live with the cognitive dissonance. So they don't. So they check out in a variety of ways. They drink too much.
Exactly.
They watch too much Kardashian, this or that. They spend too much time worrying about sports scores and trivia or whatever the preferred thing is. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you noticed? I don't know if this is the true where you live, but everywhere I've been of late, just over the last few years, the restaurants and the bars have gone from having one or two screens to having 5 or 6 televisions. There's literally not a wall that doesn't have a television talking at you.
Yeah.
That I think is the best measurement of, oh my God, help me stop thinking, help me not notice, help me drown out reality with a chorus of media babble, so that I don't have to notice just how much cognitive dissonance.
In fact, sometimes they're tuned to different stations.
They're all tuned to different stations. They're all chattering constantly because it's that or look around. It's that or, that long silent moment before everyone starts talking loudly.
Yeah. And it was interesting. When I was down in Peru, it took me 2 trips to 2 restaurants to figure it out. There were no screens anywhere.
There were no screens.
That would be for them. That would be a cultural faux pas, the grandest order, to somehow interrupt your moment to be with people and have a real conversation and meal.
And in the United States, not that long ago, that was also the case. I see this as evidence of just how stressed we are.
Yeah, and if I could give any young parent any piece of advice, it's this: just do not have a TV in your house. They are extremely sophisticated devices for shaping thought and desires, and they use the latest in neurolinguistic programming, the latest in understanding of psychological things, colors, tones, textures, the way things are put in, subliminal, you name it. They've got it is really sophisticated what they do to distract and shape opinion.
Well, I'm going to say that more generally. I think that the most useful thing that all of our listeners can do, whether they're young parents or not, get rid of your TV. Just ditch it. You don't need to spend 4 to 6 hours a night with drool puddling in your lap being programmed. People constantly ask me, well, how do you find time to write so many books and play music and take long walks and do this and do that and do the other? And my answer is very simple. I don't own a television. I haven't owned one in my adult life. So I actually have time to do things.
Yeah.
It really is that simple. Ditch your TV. You'll have all the time in the world.
It's amazing. The best thing I ever did. We haven't had one in over a decade.
I'm delighted to hear that.
It's been and we got great kids to show for it too. It's just,
hey, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So, but it's really, and I watch this level of sophistication also in how memes and ideas and other things get planted and put out there, and then people regurgitate them to me and say, "Oh no, you don't, no, like it was technology that unlocked the shale." Like, no, it was price, and price is about to lock it back up again. You'll see. It's not,
It was price on the one hand and speculative delusion on the other. Very straightforward.
Very straightforward.
The fact that the fracking, so many of the big fracking firms have never made a quarterly profit at all, ever in the course of the bubble.
Well, maybe if they just drilled faster.
No doubt.
They're going to make it down on volume. The faster we drill, the more we lose. Obviously, we need to drill more.
Exactly.
I don't know how else to put that. Well, this is a fascinating conversation because really, I could troll through the data, but the data is irrelevant at this point for the most part. It's down to psychological issues. It's around denial. Yeah. It's around our inability to face facts. It's around wanting to cling to a narrative that it's not working, but it's so much easier than having to come up with one on our own. And by the way, there's been a bunch of programming in this country to convince people that it's not appropriate to talk about things unless they've been pre-approved by the state, as it were, right? So,
of course.
It's still not appropriate to this day to mention anything really about what might have happened to Kennedy, seeing as how he was shot from the front, right there on film. That's still somehow considered, I don't know, a little edgy for people. I'm like, dude, it was 50 years ago and it's on film. What do you want me to do? He was shot from the front. I can't help it. I'm a scientist. Force equals mass times acceleration. Still, it's not okay to talk about that. Right?
No. The thing, it's very much as though when this first struck me when the media, with the changes in the media since the Berlin Wall went down, I came to the conclusion at that point that at some point thereafter, all those guys who used to come up with propaganda for Pravda and Izvestia and the various communist organs all went to work for the U.S. media. If you watch, whether it's faux news or one of the other, one of the pseudo news on the other side of the spectrum, it is so propagandistic. But there are so many ways in which our American society increasingly resembles a non-democratic state, an autocratic society in which you have to be careful what you say. Mm-hmm. We don't talk about that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of those things.
Yeah. Well, we could talk forever on that. I mean, there's so many topics that need to be opened up and discussed, but we're going to have to save that for another time because I've taken up plenty of your time, and I don't want this to run too long for our listeners. But I really want to continue this conversation because we still have to talk about the black box voting situation. We still have to talk. There's so much out there that people need to know about. Oh my goodness,
It is a target-rich environment.
It certainly is, and I think it's about to become very interesting. So that's my personal prediction: is that 2015-16, somewhere in there. We take another one of those fractal jumps down to the next level. And
I expect I would be really surprised to get through the end of this year without massive economic crisis. It could happen, but I'd be very surprised.
Yeah, well, I'm somewhere in the zone here. They've surprised me with their printing efforts so far and what they've been able to accomplish. But I agree, something. We're just one small spark away from a conflagration on this here tinder pile. So. With that, your website is thearchdruidreport.blogspot.com, and
That's
your
correct.
book, Twilights Last Gleaming.
Gleaming.
How do people get that?
You can get it from, it's available everywhere. You can get it from your local full-service bookstore or from your preferred online source. It's readily available. I also have the other book I mentioned was the nonfiction one, After Progress, Reason and Religion at the End of the Industrial Age.
Oh, fascinating.
And we can talk about that at some point.
Fascinating. Reason, religion, and the end of the industrial age. Well, as long as people don't get that 1,000-yard stare.
Oh, they will. They will.
Well, we'll have you back on and we'll talk about that one. But Twilight's Last Gleaming, I think, is a great place to start because, listen, the chance of some sort of a hot contest is not small. It's a high chance. So I think people should be aware of how that might unfold. And it sounds like your book would be a good way to explore that. So thanks for that.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we'll do this again soon, I hope.
Thank you very much for having me on.